Thank you so much for joining the Facilitation 101 training. So today we're going to go over some of the high level of what does it mean for doing facilitation work. And this is going to be broken down into 7 different sections. So we're going to talk about what are dialogue and deliberation, how do you choose the right process, and we're going to introduce a framework called the engagement streams. We'll talk about Facilitation 101, stances and responsibility, and then go into a deep dive for designing simple and inclusive conversations. We'll share some best practices on facilitating conversation core moves. I'll share with you a sample dialogue structure and then give you some encouragement and next actions before we share with you more resources and we close out. So let's get into it. What are dialogue and deliberation? These are really different kinds of conversations, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what they are and when to use them. And neither of them are good or bad. They just are what they are. But having the right conversation can really help to reduce frustration and to make your conversation even more impactful. And I'm going to use the terms dialogue and conversation, sometimes maybe even discussion interchangeably, but that's what I'm meaning here. So what is dialogue? Dialogue is a conversation between 2 or more people where we're exchanging ideas. It's characterized by people face-to-face, either virtually or in person, and sharing personal stories and experiences, and honestly expressing perspectives, clarifying viewpoints, and developing solutions. The goal of dialogue is really to deepen understanding and judgment, and to think about ways to explore an issue and to really deepen that understanding. Some of the key practices of dialogue is curiosity over certainty, listening to understand, not to respond, suspension of judgment, speaking from lived experience using I statements, making space for multiple perspectives, and staying present with ambiguity or discomfort. And what dialogue is not, it's not debate, it's not persuasion. And while the conversation can inform decisions, we aren't making collective decisions together. But that does lend us towards deliberation. Now, deliberation is a weighing of options to inform decisions or actions. Some of these key practices are using credible information and community wisdom. This helps build the base of understanding for all of us to make some kind of collective decision together. We focus on the issues and not people or personalities. In this process, we explore pros and cons and tensions. We work to identify shared values and points of difference. We consider the broader impacts on the community, not just what we as individuals want. And we seek inclusive and thoughtful decisions. The ancient Greeks had called deliberation the talk we use to teach before we act. And it's a kind of reasoning and talking that we do when a difficult decision has to be made and a great deal is at stake. And at the heart of deliberation is really weighing these possible actions and decisions carefully, examining the costs and consequences in light of what is most valuable to us. And it's really an opportunity for blending what we do in dialogue with decision making. Now, what is facilitation? I know we are joined by several people who have facilitated conversations before, and for those that have not, to facilitate to make easier. So the purpose of facilitation is guiding process so that groups can work well together, whether it's in a dialogue or it's in a deliberation. Facilitation guides the conversation, helps to design the structure and flow, support equitable participation, and helps groups stay aligned with purpose. Facilitation is not teaching content. I will appreciate the irony that in this training, I am actually going to be teaching content as opposed to facilitating a conversation, so that irony is not lost on me. And what facilitation also is not, we don't solve problems for the group. We don't advocate for a particular outcome, and we don't control people's thinking or decisions. And as a refresher, and hopefully this brings you a sense of ease, that the facilitator's role is to help a group on the how of a discussion, to support the process. And it's really the responsibility to address the journey and not the destination. So, with all that being said, you don't need to be an expert on the issue. And so many of these skill sets that we find in dialogue, deliberation, and facilitation translate so well in the outside world, beyond the room, beyond the conversation. Now, in section 2, we're going to be talking about choosing the right process. And we have a helpful framework called the engagement streams. And what this framework does is it helps to match your goals to the right kind of engagement. The NCDD engagement streams framework was collaboratively created, recognizing that there were all of these processes under dialogue and deliberation, and yet there were still so many options out there. We needed a guiding compass in order to determine what is the best approach or process within dialogue and deliberation that can best support your goals. And this framework helps people navigate the range of these approaches and to make design choices that best fit the circumstance. And why process choice matters is mismatch leads to frustration. Having clarity and a good process equals trust and progress. And you can find the engagement streams at this link. Everything will be hyperlinked in the slide deck that we send out. And also, Duncan has dropped that into the chat here. Recognize that these streams, they're a map. They're not a hierarchy, and that all 4 streams are valid depending on what your goals are. And that when we choose the right process for our conversation goals, for our engagement goals, that can lead to a more effective experience for all people, both facilitators and participants alike. Now, these are the 4 engagement streams, and I apologize, it's a bit of a small graphic here, but these are ways that we have broken down dialogue and deliberation. And with some processes, they will oftentimes overlap across a few different engagement streams, but generally as these 4 go. So we have exploration, and the purpose of this is to deepen understanding. The goal is to really learn from each other and to learn about an issue. The second is conflict transformation. In the name, it's here to navigate tensions, and the goal is to address conflict and to improve relations. Decision-making is weighing options. The goal is to help make well-informed decisions, and then collective action, working together to fuel collective action and to make an effort happen together. Now, oftentimes, generally, you'll see dialogue fall into these first 2 at the top, exploration and conflict transformation, not always, and deliberation falls within decision-making and collaborative action framework. And just some feedback that we've heard throughout the years, this was created over 20 years ago, and it's been a vital tool in dialogue and deliberation work. And Dr. Martine Carcassonne of the Colorado State University Center for Public Deliberation mentions that it succinctly introduces and organizes the diverse world of dialogue and deliberation in a very practical way. It's simple enough for beginners to not get overwhelmed, but rich enough for experienced practitioners to return to again and again. And I'm sharing these testimonials because how other folks have used these may be helpful in how you want to apply utilizing these engagement streams to choose your process. Diane Miller also mentions it not only helps give us the big picture of what methods make sense to us, but it also provides enough detail so that when people begin thinking about how they can apply these methods in local engagement efforts. And so we'll be dropping some chat prompts into the chat there. We would love to get your thoughts. What do people in your community seem to want or need more right now? Is it being heard, learning together, working through a conflict, making sense of an issue, or deciding what to do next? And so we'd love to hear, just to get you to start thinking through how to apply this training in your everyday lives and work. Now, why does this matter? Because good community engagement matters. How people come together shapes both what's possible and also the relationship and the civic infrastructure of all of our communities. Good engagement builds relationships and trust over time. It supports shared learning and understanding. It helps communities to clarify purpose and to move forward together, and ultimately strengthens the local civic infrastructure. When we have stronger community engagement practices and infrastructure within our cities and our towns and our communities, then our communities are stronger and more resilient. Now I'll give folks just a moment to respond in the chat there. Definitely hearing managing conflict is a top area of opportunity that is coming up, and that makes a lot of sense in this time. So Section 3, Facilitation 101, stance and responsibilities. And this is going to be about what do facilitators do, how do they show up, and what do they hold? It really starts with ourselves as good facilitators. How we show up sets the tone. We're the hosts of the space. And so we want to be warm, welcoming, and intentional. We want to have a calm and grounded presence. And we also want to practice active listening. And what this does is it creates a fertile ground for people to be able to show up and to share their perspectives. And that this really anchors embodied presence before mindset or skills. And so how you show up matters as much as you say. And it's really about starting from a place of strong presence before we even jump into techniques. So when we imagine helping to hold space for conversations, whether you've done it before or not, what feels exciting and what feels uncertain? I know that this world is constantly changing every day, and so it will continue to evolve, and being responsive to what's coming up for us in our bodies is a very powerful practice before we even start designing and jumping into a conversation to facilitate. Next is a facilitator mindset. And this is an extension of that inner grace, that inner presence that we have that supports more effective facilitation. And we bring this into the space, both into design and also into the conversations that we're facilitating. So we want to embody curiosity over judgment. Who feels like opening up when they feel judged? And openness to multiple perspectives. We are living in a very pluralistic society, and we want to hear from a wide range of perspectives when we're facilitating community conversations. And comfort with uncertainty. I think that's one of the beautiful aspects of facilitation is we have to be on our toes. And the more comfortable we can be with uncertainty, the more dynamic we can be as facilitators, and the more responsive we can be in the moment. And you don't need to be fearless. Fear is a normal part of the human experience. And with practice comes greater strength, but having a willingness. And so I invite you to notice which of these mindset elements feel familiar, and where is there some opportunity to really focus some growth, some practice. So before we dive too much further, I do want to address neutrality versus impartiality. And this is my perspective, and this is coming out of working in this field for over 10 years and having the privilege of getting to work with thousands of facilitators who work in both dialogue and deliberation. And there is an evolving shift in utilizing the term neutrality versus impartiality. As human beings, it is very challenging to be fully neutral. I would even say it's impossible. We live in systems of influence, as I will call them, and they impact how we show up in the world, the assumptions that we make, the biases. These are from more ancient times, very helpful practices to protect us from danger. But in modern society, those continue to imprint on us and how we show up into spaces. And so we are not neutral about process or inclusion or the humanity of everyone. We are impartial towards viewpoints as best as we can be, working to hold that suspension of judgment in order to allow someone, even if you don't agree with their viewpoints, to be able to share more is a very valuable practice. And to facilitate in the room fairly and with care. And I also want to be very clear, as facilitators, our role is to protect the container. What I mean by that is to protect the space of the conversation. And by doing so, while it is hard to completely 100% promote safety in spaces, our job is to do as best as we can to protect the dignity and well-being of everyone that we are engaging with. And so as facilitators, we do not accept dehumanizing language, violent language. While this is going to be a 101, we won't deep dive into advanced conflict navigation techniques and addressing harm. I'm going to share some resources at the end on what to do with that, but I do want to be very clear. Facilitators are not neutral. We strive to be impartial and to uphold the process with care while ensuring dignity and preventing harm. Now, self-awareness. Understanding how assumptions and power and bias show up, both in ourselves, but also in the room. And so part of our role as facilitators is noticing both our assumptions and reactions, and also what's coming up in the room, and then also how bias shapes questions and responses. And we'll talk more about framing and how to do as best as we can to remove bias from framing to ensure that we are creating language and space that are welcoming to as many people as possible, or to all. We have a responsibility of paying attention to power dynamics. Each of us comes into the space with elements of certain power dynamics, whether they are +1 or -1 power dynamics. How we facilitate can help to balance some of the power dynamics. And this also extends to whether someone is an introvert or an extrovert. Extroverts may feel more comfortable participating in a conversation, and people who are more introverted or even like more thoughtful, they may need more time in order to process what's coming up, how they want to share their thoughts. And so our role as facilitators is to help balance out some of the power dynamics and the air time for participants. And understanding your own comfort level with tension. Especially what we're hearing from the chat is that there is a lot of conflict coming up in our communities. And Duncan and I did a training recently on and brought up such a valuable point that conflict is such a natural part of our human experience. Conflict itself is neither good nor bad, but it is what we project onto it and how it impacts our bodies and our minds and our hearts that can be negative. And what can be a powerful practice as a facilitator is to really get comfortable with tension, to understand what triggers you. Is it silence? Is it raised voices? And to prepare yourself, to practice, to do grounding processes in order to work through that tension. And this self-awareness really allows you to pause instead of react, to create that space in the moment for you to show up as your highest self, as your highest facilitator for the benefit of all in the room. Now, some core responsibilities of facilitators, and this is the brass tacks before, during, and after an event. These are just some high level. I'm trying to be mindful that there is a lot of text here. And so high level before a conversation even happens is clarifying purpose, designing the process, and to prepare for the event. And I'll go much further into all of these throughout the training. During, it's upholding the process, supporting the container, but also encouraging participation from all in the room and managing time. If you aren't lucky to have a timekeeper with you, we help to guide the group through the experience. And so part of that is managing time. And afterwards, it's reflection, it's following up, and if it's applicable, next actions. This isn't always the case with every conversation. Sometimes there is benefit to conversation for understanding and relationship's sake. And one mention with follow-up, if you say you're going to do something, it is important to follow up because that is what helps build trust. And the more transparent we can be, the greater that trust can be. So this is all some of the core responsibilities that you're not just facilitating the moment, but you're really stewarding the experience. Now, some common misconceptions that good conversations don't need structure. I mean, as humans, we talk every single day. And also in dialogue and deliberation, it is vital to have good structure because that can support more meaningful engagement. Another is that facilitators need to have all the answers. Absolutely not. We are here to hold the space to guide the process. We are really tapping the collective wisdom of the people who are in the room with us. And that safety happens automatically. Safety is created intentionally. And again, while we can't 100% create a safe space, we can create a brave space, a courageous space. Some have called it a resilient space, but we can also, as the facilitators, protect the space. And so I want to normalize that these are myths, that many in this field have held them, but we can release ourselves of that now and to really allow this to be a confidence building moment. You don't have to have all the answers. With good preparation and process, a lot of incredible connections and collective action can be made. Now, section 4, designing simple and inclusive conversations. What I would love to plant a seed with you is, as you think about the conversations that you've been a part of, what's helped them to feel welcoming or safe or brave enough to participate in? We would love to share your experiences in the chat. Again, we'll be pulling that out for future reference, but we want to hear from you. What has been your experience on this? Now, designing simple and inclusive conversations. This next section, we're going to be talking about how to plan conversations that are clear, supportive, and purposeful, and thus ideally will hopefully be even more impactful. And before we jump into things, we want to get clarity. What is our purpose? What are the outcomes? And who needs to be involved? And so here are a few guiding questions to help you get clarity. On the purpose, really think through, what is the purpose of gathering? What impact do we want this conversation to have? And then when we think about outcomes, because this can then help us to match the conversation with the process that we want to use and to also set ourselves up for success. But what does success really look like? What is realistic to accomplish in one conversation? I know that there is a lot going on in this world. I like to sometimes say that facilitators and community engagement practitioners, we are social firefighters, and that there is always a figurative fire that is happening that we have to put out. But one step at a time, one action at a time, one conversation at a time. And so being realistic can help us to manage those expectations. And last is participants. Who needs to be in the room? And then on the flip side, who is missing in that list, that mapping effort that you may do, and why? And if the purpose is fuzzy, then everything else is going to be harder. And so when we clarify what the purpose is, that will make everything a lot easier. And the reality is we are working with people. People are beautiful, but also messy and complex. And the conversation itself with good process can be a much smoother experience if we have clarity from the start. Now, engaging community partners is a vital practice when we're starting to design a community conversation, a deliberation, and working with trusted voices both strengthens relevance and reach, and also can be such a powerful relationship to engage both in this conversation, but also moving forward. We want to be in relationship with other people in our communities. So, more reasons why community partners matter is community partners can be soundboard. They can allow you to ensure that the relevance of your topic is true to what their experience is in the community. They can also help with framing and co-designing the actual process and the event. Working with community partners also lends credibility and context. And then it also is an opportunity to really expand the reach to participants. When we authentically engage with community partners, then our entire experience is going to be enriched. And I want to also pause and make a very clear distinction to come from a relational framework as opposed to a transactional framework. We are wanting to build true relationships in our communities, not just use people for their soundboarding, for their networks, for their time. And so really keeping that lens in the forefront of your mind as you are continuing, hopefully, to strengthen relationships with community partners. So who you can consider as partners, these are just some offerings: organizations that are already trusted by the community, people or groups connected to those most affected by the issue, informal leaders and not just formal institutions. And another powerful practice is, who else should I be speaking with? We don't know what we don't know. And so really engaging the wisdom of your community partners can be a powerful practice. And I also have a mention here about helicoptering. Now, this is a practice of helicoptering into a community, dropping in to either a wider community or into a particular population or space within the community. This is a practice we do not want to do, where we drop in, do the work, and then drop out. We are looking to create more ongoing cultures of engagement within our community to really strengthen those civic and community ties. And helicoptering can be an incredibly harmful practice. And so when we engage with community partners, that's when we can really avoid that helicoptering phenomenon. Some outreach basics. These are very high level. I'll provide you more resources where you can learn more to really deepen your outreach or your organizing skills. But it is about inviting the right people in clear and accessible ways. Outreach should reflect who you want in the room and why this conversation matters to them. Some of the outreach basics are ensuring that we're using plain language over jargon, that there is a clear purpose and what to expect, and then that we are using multiple channels over one blast. And there's an incredibly powerful practice. It's called targeted universalism. It comes from the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. And to summarize this, what it is it's using a culturally competent lens to really be thoughtful and how each person, each population is influenced by their culture, and to engage with that person or that population in a way that is tailored and mindful and intentional based on what their cultural experience is. And this is yet another place where community partners can be a very powerful team member to making sure that we are framing the purpose, the outreach in a way that is really going to land well with a specific population or a wider audience. So when we think about designing simple and inclusive conversations, once we've gotten some clarity, we're working with community partners, it's so much more fun to do this with friends and with partners, side note, and also it strengthens all of what I'm going to talk about next, is really getting clear on what the conversation focuses on, what's the topic, and then making sure in the framing or how the conversation is described and figuratively bounded, and then format, how people are going to interact during the conversation. And I want to emphasize that these are design choices to be intentional. They are not passive, and that with good design can come more effective conversations. And I also want to gently encourage that there is no such thing as perfection ultimately. But if we are coming in with good intentions, if we are working with partners, then we can develop a more effective conversation design and thus be a more effective facilitator. So, choosing a topic, what you invite people to talk about really matters. So, we want to choose a topic that is relevant to the community, that is aligned with goals and purpose, and that is appropriate for dialogue, not debate. And how do we decide this? And this is speaking to a chat prompt that I'm reading in terms of who is the right people and who decides. Do a map the topic areas that are coming out, map who is working in the community on those topics, consult the broader community and find out what they want to discuss. Oftentimes, the first step before we actually finalize a topic is listening to community members. Talk to your friends and family. Engage with local media and hear what's coming out of the community needs. And then ask those partners who in the community is working with the people you want to reach, and listen to what is coming up in their work. And know that not every topic is right for dialogue. Especially as facilitators, there is a particular skill set to topics that can be potentially more polarizing, and it can be a best practice to work on topics that are not as thorny, or as they sometimes are called, the wicked problems, before we jump into anything deeper, and allowing you the opportunity to build those confidence and to make sure that you're ready for what the feedback and the engagement that you'll be receiving around a particular topic. And it doesn't have to be off the table forever, but just until the skill set and confidence is there. Now, with framing the conversation, this is really how we describe the conversation that shapes expectations. It's what the conversation is about and what it is not about. And that framing shapes tone and expectations. The language that we use matters. And so ensuring that we are vetting both the topic, but also the overall framing of the conversation, the outreach language with other people, not just ourselves, because we do have our own lens, but it gets stronger when we allow others to kick the tires, give feedback, and to ensure that we are utilizing language that is inclusive. And think about how it's worded, specifically around, does it contain potentially biased language or seem to have an intended outcome? And what would people of various perspectives, experiences, etc., feel welcomed to be part of this conversation? And so engaging with others, getting their feedback to ensure that we are framing the conversation in a way that will resonate is key to the next aspect of designing inclusive conversations. Have people read out what the framing is and get their feedback on what that is. Now, this is going to be key to how we craft questions, and I'll talk about that more a little bit later. But this is just overall framing of the conversation. Now, the next part of designing community conversations, designing a dialogue, is to really think through the design, where and how people are going to gather, and that we want to match the conversation format with the goals and with the group size. And here's a graphic that gives a breakdown of traditional model of community conversations. These are oftentimes in person. People may be seated in a circle, talking together at one time. This may be a series of conversation, but oftentimes the conversations are isolated from one another. And a multimodal model of community conversations or dialogues is that conversations can happen both synchronously and asynchronously. And what we mean by this is utilizing a hybrid model. So are you going to host your conversation online? Are you going to host it in person? Do you have the opportunity to do a hybrid? Because that can improve the accessibility of a conversation. Not everyone can show up in person, whether due to time or ability. And having the ability, whether it is through a virtual input like posting on social media, having a survey, having Zoom, allowing as many people as possible to participate in the way that feels comfortable to them can increase the accessibility of whatever you're trying to engage around. And so these are offerings to really think in a diverse way on how you want to engage with folks, both in person if possible, because that can be a wonderful way to connect with one another, but also other hybrid models. And start simple. You don't have to do a complex process to have a meaningful conversation. And so as we think about the process, this is going to be the conversation format or how people interact during a conversation. Like I mentioned, there's the whole group discussion where the whole group is coming together to share on a topic, breaking into small groups or coming into pairs or trios. And some pro tips here as an offering to keep your conversation small and nimble, ideally no more than 15. I would say, depending on your time frame, even like 8 or 10 can be a lot. We want to create an environment in the format where people can all participate. And when there is a large group, it makes it harder for everyone to feel like they have the appropriate time for them to share their perspectives. And what's great about conversations of 14, 15, break those into 6 or 7. And that can be a more powerful tool and method in the conversation format. Also, if you do end up going into either smaller groups or pairs or trios, sometimes these are called dyads or triads, then this is a great opportunity to connect the wisdom that is being brought into those smaller conversations into the larger space. Having a large group report out either a representative from the small group or having folks popcorn a few different themes can be really helpful to inform the wider group of what's been happening in the room. And these different formats support different kinds of participation, and that we want to really emphasize creating the space where we can promote a space of clarity and care and communication. So creating a supportive container. Now, this is really setting shared expectations that support participation. This involves purpose, group agreements, roles, and inclusion basics. And to reaffirm that inclusion is designed for, it is not assumed. And that when we utilize these practices for creating a supportive container, it really allows people to show up better, helps for people to relax when participants have the ability to understand what's coming up, then they can really be able to show up in a better way. Now, the purpose statement is really drawing that clarity forward and articulating it both to yourselves as co-designers, facilitators, but then also to the wider community. Why are we here and what are we doing? So use these questions to really guide that decision making. Why are we here? What do we hope to do together? And this clear purpose really allows people to show up better, and it allows you to facilitate on a stronger footing. So with group agreements, these are really powerful tools that we can use. Sometimes, and previously, little less so now, they used to be called ground rules. We've shifted these to group agreements. So you may hear these terms used interchangeably. And these are really shared expectations for how we treat one another. Now, with group agreements, these guidelines both guide us in how we treat one another, but also how we participate. Group agreements are meant to create a safe space for all participants. They are shared commitments for how we're going to engage with one another. And they are also powerful tools that can be used when a conversation may feel like it's starting to go off topic. And what I mean by that is group agreements are set in the beginning part of a conversation or an event. The best practice is having them laid out either in a printed handout or on a projector, and then having everyone the ability to actually read through those group agreements and or having a facilitator to list them out verbally. We want to be mindful in terms of accessibility. People process information in different ways. So having visual opportunity to read the group agreements, but also articulating them. In times when we're a little bit pressed, the practice would be, here are the group agreements. Can we get buy-in from everyone? And folks can give a virtual thumbs up or give space for any pushback. If we have a little bit more time, there's an opportunity to further refine the group agreements. I find that, especially when working with folks who haven't been facilitating for very long, or they're new as a participant to a community conversation, it's helpful to have some starting agreements as opposed to completely coming from scratch. But then invite, is there another group agreement that should be added here? And then get consensus from the group to actually formally add it on. And then you get buy-in from the entire group. And what that does is it creates that group commitment for us to engage with one another based on these agreements that we've outlined and agreed to, and using those as a tool if anything happens later. So if things go off rail, what we can gently invite people back is, in our group agreements, we mentioned X. I'd like to bring the conversation back to this. So NCDD has a wide range of group agreements from different organizations. And I also want to share with you some sample group agreements so you understand what I'm talking about. And those are speaking from your own experience, using I statements, listening to understand, not respond, sharing the space so that everyone has a chance to speak. Sometimes this can be called move up, move back. Previously, it used to be called step up, step back, but in the spirit of being inclusive for folks who use mobility devices, move up, move back is a more inclusive way of framing that. Also encourage folks that it's okay to pass. We don't want to force people to contribute if they're still processing, if they don't feel comfortable or safe. So allowing that as an out is a powerful group agreement. Respecting confidentiality when requested, and to assume good intentions and to really attend to the impact if something does happen where perhaps someone is feeling dissed or harmed actively. And with these sample group agreements, there's so many more out there, but these are some of the most common ones that I do want to share with you. And because they're such a powerful tool, I did want to spend a little bit more time on making sure that there is some clarity on this. And I love the feedback. I prefer commitments or rules when we have not actually discussed things and invited agreement. And that's fair. These are an opportunity for us to get agreement on these guidelines, shall we say. Now, the roles in the room, having clarity about who does what brings peace of mind, and it makes for smoother events and facilitation. This generally is broken down into facilitator, plural. It is so much more fun to co-facilitate with someone and also can make for a stronger event. Participants, those who are in the room contributing to the conversation, and then support roles. these support roles can either be from the facilitator team or they can be volunteer participants, ensuring that there is actual consent from people when they volunteer, but a timekeeper, so inviting someone in the room to help keep track of time during the conversation. This is more for when you're in small group breakouts. Note taker, so when we're in small groups, dyads, triads, but even in the larger groups, having someone to annotate, and some best practice is to do it in front of people. So when we're virtual, having a shared notes document where everyone can see how their voice is being captured and their thoughts. And then in the room, it's those big, the facilitator papers, the white papers, the easels, and having someone who can support what is being shared in the group and to make sure that that is accurately tracked. One other support role is, at least that most often comes up in facilitation and community engagement. This is going to be the report out person. So if you're in small groups and you're going to come back to the wider group, help manage expectations and not call anyone out on the spot, ideally, by inviting someone at the start of the breakout or small group conversation to be someone that will report out to the wider group and allow people who feel more comfortable doing that to step forward. Not everyone feels comfortable speaking in a larger group, and we want to ensure that people feel safe in that way. So these are some inclusion basics, and NCDD, in partnership with the American Library Association, wrote a guide, an accessibility guide, where we do a deep dive into accessibility and increasing inclusivity or the belongingness of the space. And while that guide is tailored towards librarians, I highly recommend you check it out because it is very applicable to people who are doing facilitation work and community engagement at large. So this is really designing for participation and not just attendance. So using clear and accessible language. And what we mean by that is to remove the technical, the jargon heavy language. We want to ensure that people who are trying to engage in the space know what they're engaging around and can fully comprehend what the dialogue, the conversation is about. And there is a recommendation to use language that is generally at an 8th grade reading level. Some even say a 4th grade reading level. And we also want to be mindful, are we reaching out to English speakers? Are we reaching out to speakers of another language? And to ensure that if you are reaching out to a broader multilingual audience, to really use plain language so folks can engage. A saying that I've heard is use language that people hope and dream in. And it's that heart language. And also, this is where co-partners can help, or the community partners, the co-designers with you can also help to ensure that there is clear and accessible language. Also use multiple ways to participate. And this is what we talked about with the different conversation models. So are we going to be hosting an in-person conversation, but can we also host a virtual conversation to supplement that in-person? Can we also provide a survey where people who need more time and thought to their feedback and their insights, that they have an opportunity to share their voice in a way that works for their minds and bodies? And also being thoughtful of the timing of our community conversations, of our dialogues, of our deliberations. Are these happening during the weekday, 9 to 5? If so, then there's only going to be a particular group of folks that can join those conversations. And when we talk about offering multiple ways to participate, can we mix up how we actually schedule the events? So if we have one during the weekday, 9 to 5, can we hold one during the weeknight in the evening times with a reasonable understanding and boundary around how late the conversation would go? do we have the opportunity to host this on the weekend? Because at different seasons of our lives, we will be able to attend certain time frames. And so having a variety of ways to actually be able to engage is a powerful practice to ensure a greater inclusion to the conversation. Also, name norms that support equity. And so I appreciate that in this current era that we're living, sometimes we do have to be mindful about the language that we're using. And terms like diversity, inclusivity, accessibility cannot always be languaging that we can use. And so if that is where you, your community are at, that is absolutely acceptable because we want to use language that is going to reach a broad range of people. And if certain terms don't resonate with the widest audience, then that is something that you can decide with your team, with your community partners. And that also means that also doesn't mean that we don't ensure that equitable practices are still built into the design of the framing, the outreach, the actual conversation, because that is our role to uphold, to ensure that we are using spaces to promote a wide sense of belonging that are welcoming to a wide range of people. And so just because we may not be able to use terms like accessibility, inclusivity, diversity, sometimes even democracy, there are alternative terms that can be used that are still getting to the sense of what we mean. The Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement created a report called the Language Perception Report. And they analyze the way that different terms land for different populations, and that this can be one of many powerful tools to modify the languaging that you're using, because ultimately we don't want to alienate or offend anyone. And sometimes even the words that we use can do that. And so when we think about inclusivity, and I'm unashamedly going to be using that term because that is what we want to foster with our dialogues, with our deliberation, is a wide range of participation from a broad representation, if not as many people as possible in the community. And so it's something that we can continue to strive for, even if we have to modify the languaging. And so these are just some of the ways that we can be thoughtful about how we design our community engagement events, but also how we can show up in this space. And so this is very, very high level. Again, I encourage you to check out the accessibility guide that we have drafted. And so the more that we can foster a place where people can show up, bring their whole selves to the full extent of their humanity and their dignity for all, then that is a powerful way that we can show up in this work and create, foster, and follow up on the container. So when we are using these practices around having a purpose statement, using group agreements, having clear roles, having inclusivity in how we create events and how we facilitate, this creates a supportive container for people. And that allows people to understand what's expected, to feel respected and safe enough to participate, and to stay focused on purpose. Now, the final aspect of designing simple and inclusive conversations that I want to speak on are crafting good questions. Now, this is designing prompts that invite reflection and learning. And I have a tool, a helpful tip sheet that I will provide for you. And we'll also talk a little bit more about framing good questions. But what makes a good question is questions that are open-ended, that are clear and simple, that invite reflection and not defense. Good questions Allow participants to explore values and experiences and hopes, and they focus on the possibility. They also help to deepen understanding and to evoke more questions. And so we're going to talk about a range of different questions that can address some of these. But overall, when we are thinking about good questions, and these are the questions that we bring into the dialogue, the deliberation, that are ideally co-created with your facilitation team, with your community partners to ensure that they are resonating with the ultimate goal and purpose of your event. We also want to avoid yes or no questions. That doesn't yield anything helpful. In many ways, what can be more illustrative is to ask those open-ended questions where people have the opportunity to elaborate on what their experience is. Good questions do not seek a correct answer. Again, we're not trying to persuade people, but we are trying to create the space for which people can share their thoughts and insights. Avoid leading or stacked questions, and I'll go through some examples of what I mean by that next. And then questions that assume agreement. So it's really working to craft good questions that invite people to participate, not to shoehorn someone into a specific answer. Good questions open doors, bad ones close them. And so with this crafting of good questions, use simplicity, use curiosity, because that can create a richer ground for people to communicate in. Now, there is a great power in how we frame questions, and that different questions invite different conversations and also different participation. So I'm going to share two examples of some different questions. And what do you notice about how each question shapes the conversation? So the first topic is on public schools. And the initial question was, is there a way to fix them? Now, what is the challenge with this question is there is an inherent belief that the public schools are broken. And so that is going to close off specific feedback, specific people from wanting to even engage in this question. The next updated version was public schools, are they making the grade? And again, this still has a bias around public schools that they are not making the grade. And so when we think about what is a good question, how can we have balance and be more impartial in how we design our questions in order to elicit a wider range of participation and feedback? The final version was public schools, how can students get the education they need? So this is no longer including a underlying bias that public schools are failing, but really looking towards that possibility. How can students get the education they need? And this will create a container that will elicit a wider range and more robust feedback on the subject of public schools in this community. The second is that around coal and certain types of energy usage. And the first question was, how do we move beyond coal? And this came out of work that was done in West Virginia, which for folks who don't know is a strong and proud coal community. There are generations of people who have been in the coal industry. And so when the first question is developed around how can we move beyond coal, that will elicit a lot of fear, a lot of pushback. Some people don't believe that the coal industry should be impacted or even eliminated from the region. And so that's automatically going to turn people off, and it's going to offend some folks. People who do work, all labor has dignity. And so this will rub against some very strong core values within some of the participants in the room. The next version of it is, how can we diversify our economy? And again, this has one, it's a little bit unclear, and some folks may not feel that we need to diversify our economy. And so it won't elicit as wide range of participation because someone may come into or read the outreach and think to themselves that I absolutely do not think that we need to diversify our economy. I'm happy with how it is. And so they won't even participate. But we still want to hear the voices of everyone in our community. And so a final version of this is how can we build a strong economic future? And again, this is using that future facing language, that creating space for possibilities. And with this iteration of it, it can really allow a broader range of people to actually contribute to a conversation. Now, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into this is for the overall kind of purpose, like the main question around an event. But I am going to give you examples of other questions in future sections. But before we do, I want to switch gears a little bit to dive into how do we have some good core moves when we're facilitating conversation. So I've walked you through some of the touch points when you're designing a simple and inclusive conversation. But I also want to reflect on what are some of the core moves that you as a facilitator can hold when you're in the room and starting to facilitate a conversation. And when we think back, for those who have participated in a dialogue or deliberation, whether you have facilitated it yourself or have been a participant in an event, we want to hear what are some good best practices that you've experienced in well-facilitated conversations. And one, we're going to draw this wisdom out and share it out with a wider group, but also helping to share with fellow attendees on what does well-facilitated conversations really look like? What are some of those best practices? And so I'll share some from here, but please add on +1. We want to hear a wide range of what's worked for you, either as a facilitator or as a participant. But these are going to be the practical techniques for guiding conversations in real time. And so one of the primary core moves, the roles as a facilitator, is to support participation, to draw people in while balancing voices. And what this looks like is inviting quieter voices in, to balance airtime, and to normalize multiple ways for people to participate. And so what this can look like is when you're facilitating a conversation, perhaps you have someone that is more extroverted or has a more dominant identity or is familiar with the space. And so they feel more comfortable sharing and they may dominate the conversation. And so some ways to help support a participation from all folks in the circle or in the room is utilizing language like, and I would also, for me personally, say, thank you so much for sharing. We haven't heard from everyone yet, and creating space to invite those quieter voices. If you're continuing to have someone to share their thoughts, I strongly encourage to still come from a place of gratitude. We want to be graceful and kind in our facilitation, at least for me personally, and thanking people for their contributions, but also let's pause and hear from a few new voices. And if it feels right and you have a ability to actually invite people by name, that can be helpful, but do it with the spirit of tentativeness, with invitation. You don't want to put people on the spot who may not be ready. And you can also remind them that they can pass if they don't feel comfortable sharing their thoughts at that time. And also normalizing the multiple ways to participate. Not everyone participates in vocalizing their thoughts immediately. Some need time to process, some need to take notes. It can be helpful if you're doing in person to have pens and papers so folks can write down their thoughts while they're processing before they're ready to actually contribute. And so when we normalize that people show up into a space in a wide range of ways, that one fosters how they are as a human, how they engage in the room, but also the kind of conversation that we ultimately can have. Next core move of facilitation is managing the flow. And this is helping the group to stay oriented and make sense together. And what this looks like is naming transitions, summarizing periodically, and normalizing silence. And on the recent DRH training, there was a great quote that as facilitators, we are usually much more experienced with holding space for silence. And silence can be such a powerful space to hold in a conversation. It may seem counterintuitive for people who are newer to facilitation practice, but one, that allows quieter voices, more introverted voices, people who need more time to process, to actually have the space to share their contributions. When there's this feeling of having to jump in edgewise, then it can create a lot of tension in a conversation. And so our role as to facilitators when we're holding the container is to help manage the flow and to work the group through the process, whatever the questions are. I'm just going to say, like, for example, question 1, share it with the group, encourage all to participate. If you get to a bit of a lull and you still have time, inviting more folks to share, and then helping the group to move to the second question and helping to keep track of those transitions, articulate them to the group. If you need support for timekeeping, you can always ask to have someone help keep you on time, because sometimes when we're facilitating, you can be really deep in the trenches and so present with a group that it can be hard to manage that time. So having someone to support managing that flow and that timing can be really helpful. And then also summarizing what's coming up. And that's using some reflective dialogue practices. And some example language is, let me pause us and reflect what I'm hearing and then try to summarize this. It's also a good practice when we're using that reflective dialogic practice. And to be clear, dialogic practices show up in deliberation, but those reflective communication practices, because then you're also ensuring that you have accurately heard what another person has shared. And it also gives them the opportunity to correct you, essentially, or to restate what they were saying. Perhaps that is what they said, but upon reflection, they have the ability to add on or to clarify. And so this can be a powerful way to ensure that we are accurately comprehending what another person is sharing, and also allowing them the space to further clarify. And when the conversation may go off topic, then we can use language like, we're shifting from shared experiences to reflecting on themes to help draw folks for the kind of purpose of whatever the section is. If you're starting to veer off into the wider themes, but not sharing from lived experience. And so the role of a facilitator is helping to manage some of those dynamics. And to go a little bit deeper into redirecting, because especially in these times when people are feeling like their communities are more polarized, that there may be more tension, that there is an active industrial complex that is fomenting outrage and polarization, that for people who are on the ground, oftentimes we don't actually see it manifesting in our communities, but still that belief can still exist. And it can also show up in our community conversations, in our dialogues, our deliberations. And so there are practices that we can use to help bring the conversation back with care and really centering the humanity of each person, but also balancing that with the role that we have as facilitators to protect the process, protect the conversation, and to protect participants. And what this can look like is gently returning the group to the purpose. Example is, let's connect this back to our purpose. It doesn't have to be complex language, just a gentle redirect to where we are actually supposed to be on topic. Reframing questions when needed. So say you've had a well-crafted, good question, but it may not always land with everyone. If you can tell on folks like face, their nonverbals, if they are actually processing and understanding what that question is, if they're not able to immediately respond, would it be helpful for me to reframe and then reframe the question as needed? To reaffirm agreements, and this is going back to what I mentioned of using the group agreements, the guidelines as tools to help redirect people. So let's say one of the group agreements is speaking from lived experience using I statements. And you have a participant that says, well, you said X, Y, Z. It's a helpful practice and important one, because there could be some tension directed between individuals starting to form, but also to remind folks of the group agreement. We made a commitment at the beginning part of this conversation to speak from lived experience and invite them to reframe whatever they're saying, if it makes sense, to come from an I statement. And this is something that with practice, you'll continue to feel out how to navigate that threshold from tension to harm and to conflict. Again, conflict isn't always bad. When people are passionate about something, it's because they care. And that's oftentimes where conflict can come from. When we are apathetic, we don't care. And that's not often an environment for tension and conflict to arise. And so recognizing the potential values of where those statements are coming from, but also ensuring that they are not veering into dehumanizing, yeah, that works, dehumanizing language. And there are practices that NCDD is part of that Libraries Transforming Communities initiative. We are in the midst of finalizing a polarizing conversations guide. It is not public and published yet. We are putting the final touches. It is now to the copy editor, but that is going to be a deep dive in how to navigate polarizing conversations, moments of tension, and when we need to utilize some of the conflict navigation practices. And we do talk about addressing harm in that guide. So stay tuned for that, but I don't want to go too much deeper since this is a 101. Good process can help to protect from the conversation getting to that place, and using these practices of redirecting can help to bring the heat down and to de-escalate a situation before it gets further. And this is going back to that self-awareness and the work that we each have to do as facilitators of staying grounded and regulating yourself to support the group. Our nervous system really does set the tone for how people engage with one another. And this can be a really challenging practice, but also it's some of the greatest tools that we can have as facilitators. And that can look like grounding ourselves, using breath work, giving the moment a space, a little bit more distance before responding. There's also other grounding tools, like you can have some people like to have like an object or a stone to hold, having a mantra. You can also slow down the pace of your words, because when the words are very escalated and they're moving really fast, that can also kind of bring the energy up, and not always in the best of way for a conversation, especially when tensions are starting to rise. So slowing things down for the group, recognizing if you're feeling an urge to fix something, So our goal isn't to solve problems, it is to hold the process. And while we have a responsibility to protect other participants from any kind of dehumanizing language, it is also important and a vital practice to figuratively hold space, step back, hold space if people are kind of working through something, and being at that point some semblance of a mediator in terms of also keeping the temperatures cooled. And if need be, you can also step out, take a break, invite the group to take a break. These are all practices for staying grounded in times of in times of community engagement, especially if tensions are rising. So with facilitation, there are some common pitfalls that can arise, and these are just invitations, something to watch for. And if it didn't land well, if it wasn't resonating with this, like the way you want to show up as a facilitator, how you can recover from it. But this can look like over explaining, and that could really come from feeling uncomfortable in that silence. So you're trying to fill it, but say what you have to say and then allow people space to process. Ask if they need clarification. And another common pitfall can be ignoring power dynamics. I can appreciate, especially depending on your identity, how you show up, what's your comfort level with conflict, that addressing power dynamics can be intimidating, but also process well designed can help to work through those power dynamics, but we can't just let them go unchecked. We can't let someone completely dominate the conversation. This isn't the Senate floor. We're not filibustering. This is supposed to be a conversation where all perspectives are being heard. And we also cannot allow for any dehumanizing language or potential violence to be incurred. And so that is our responsibility, to not ignore those power dynamics. And another pitfall is vague or stacked questions. So when questions aren't clear, people don't know how to answer. And so they don't know exactly what kind of feedback or what part of their lived experience they should share. And then when we're stacking questions, it's too much for folks to respond. It can really muddy the water on the engagement space. And so ask really simple, straightforward questions, break them up into rounds. They can feed into one another. And this can all help to create clearer, more coherent community engagement experience. Also, letting those dominant voices take over, similar to the power dynamics, to utilize those redirecting gratitude, but also let's hear from someone else. And it can also look like skipping synthesis or closure. We want to create and steward a good experience. And so the synthesis can look like, at the end of a conversation, we're hearing a large group report out. And we're also working to bring together what are some of the themes that were coming out of maybe a wider group experience. And then closing. And we'll talk more about some of these steps in this next section. But we want to make sure that we are closing up the experience. So what I'm going to share with you next is a simple dialogue structure. Now, this is going to be more focused on dialogue. We are going to talk more about deliberation in a future training, and NCD has lots of resources to learn more about deliberative structures. But this is a very straightforward, easy agenda for guiding a conversation from start to finish. And so with this structure, I'll give you a moment just to check that out while I also get water. So very, very simple dialogue structure includes opening, space for exploration, space for reflection, and closing. And this is a very simple, repeatable agenda for meaningful conversations. Now, when we look at like the engagement streams framework, there's going to be specific processes that will oftentimes align with this, but I want to give you a conversation structure that you could implement as soon as possible in your communities. once you're ready. And that this context works, or this template works in many different contexts, and it's especially good for early relationship building conversations. So with this first section, this is we're in the room. The dialogue is happening. The opening section is really to help people feel welcomed, oriented, and clear about why they're here. It's going to include welcome and orientation, introductions, whether that's the facilitators, or if you're in a large group, that can look like turn to your partner and introduce yourself. In small groups, people are able to introduce themselves so we can bring our name into the space. Next is the group agreements. After that will be the purpose and why are we here? And then an opening question or a personal stake. Sometimes this can be called an icebreaker, a conversation warmer, but it's really allowing people the opportunity to transition from their days into the space. And so some example questions that can help to allow folks the opportunity to transition and really drop into the conversation can be, what brings you to this conversation today? What's one experience that shaped how you think about this issue? What would make this conversation feel worthwhile to you? And so these are to help get the conversational energy going for your event. Next are exploration. And while these are broken down into kind of 4 areas, the exploration can sometimes be the larger section where there may be rounds of exploratory questions that are within this overall section. But what the purpose of this is to hear different perspectives so that the group can better understand the issue. And this can include story sharing, perspective taking, and surfacing assumptions. So some example questions are, what's important to you about this issue? What concerns do you hear from others? And what assumptions do we need to test? And there's a lot of recommendations on NCDD for different kinds of questions and other great organizations that we're going to lift up at the end of this training that give us some other ways that we can explore around a specific area. And in the third area, it's going to be reflection. And this is to create a space of pause, to make sense of what the group has heard so far. And this can include naming themes or noticing patterns, and then surfacing what's missing, and really providing an opportunity for the group to hear themselves, to hear what's being reflected back to them. And some example questions can be, what stood out to you? What patterns or themes are emerging? And what feels missing from this conversation? And then this will lead us into the closing section. We want to put the figurative bow on this event. And this helps bring the conversation to a meaningful close and also acknowledge the work that the group did, the space that was shared. And so this can include synthesis from the exploration or reflection periods. This absolutely, should include appreciation. Thank you so much for joining, because this is one of our most precious resources, is our time and energy and insights to a conversation. And we want to really honor that at every single event that we go to. And if it's appropriate, next actions. We don't want to overcommit. And so if you still need time to process what are those next actions, if you're taking any, then just clarify that. Be transparent. People appreciate transparency over fluff. Some example questions can be, what's one takeaway that you're leaving with today? What do you appreciate about today's conversation? And what questions feel most alive moving forward? And it is okay if there are no actions to be taken, but we want to at least give a sense of completion to the conversation that we've been having. So that was a very, very simple dialogue structure, just to give you an overall idea of where you would be. And I also want to encourage that the facilitator's role is throughout all of those areas, and also give you some encouragement and some next actions for moving forward with facilitation and bringing it into practice, or potentially refining the practice that you're already doing. So what we would love to hear is, what's one thing that you feel more prepared for after today, even if you're not ready to host a conversation? And I greatly appreciate, this is a lot of information. It is being recorded. We are going to send out the slide deck so you can refer back. And I also am wanting to hear from each of you if there is anything that allows you to feel more prepared, that also gives us some insight into the future trainings that we're continuing to develop. So as we move forward, facilitation is a practice. I am honored to be in a room where I see some folks that have been doing this for a very long time, and I'm so blessed for their wisdom. They've helped to influence me as a facilitator, and that is such a blessing. And even after 10 years of hosting a wide range of conversations, it's still a practice. The opportunity for us to continue to learn and grow and continue to try to do better the next time is such a powerful mindset when you're doing facilitation work. And so, some gentle reminders: you don't have to have all the answers, that these facilitation skills grow through practice. Small conversations can build confidence and can help you strengthen those facilitator muscles. Reflection is a huge part of the work, and that every conversation teaches you something. It's one of the things I love most about this work is every single conversation, there's something new. There's some new insight, some new person, some new experience to hear. It is dynamic. And if you come in with a learning mindset, there's so much to learn from the people that you're continuing to work with and engage. And so with this work, you don't need mastery, that it is okay to start in small ways if you've never facilitated before. And there are so many resources for you to turn to that we'll share a little bit more in a few moments here. I also want to remind you that you're part of a larger ecosystem, and that there is thousands of people that are doing facilitation work. There are millions of people here in this country that are hungry for better ways to connect with one another, less polarization. And so that this work helps to support a healthy civic life through conversation. These skills support learning, trust, and shared purpose, not just for yourself, but also for people who are participating. It is incredible the reactions that people can have when they actually experience a well-facilitated conversation. I didn't know this was possible. I learned something new. That sense of awe is so remarkable. And it's things like that that touch the heart and spirit that carry it forward, that we do have the ability to have good conversations, to hear one another, no matter what tension, conflict, or polarizations are happening. Sometimes you need a little bit of a stronger structure. Maybe you need a little bit of a more skilled conflict transformation practitioner or a mediator, but it can be done. And recognize that there are so many people that are doing facilitation work across the country, across the world. We, as facilitators, whether you identify as a professional or just someone who's passionate about doing facilitation work, you are part of a global network of people who have the skills to listen and support conversations with one another and to build connection and relationships. And that change often starts with people being heard. There are so many people in this world that don't feel heard. And that's when tension can arise. That's when isolation can arise. That's when violence can oftentimes arise, because people don't feel heard. And so when we foster spaces where those experiences, people who feel like they aren't heard, are able to genuinely be heard in an authentic way, that can be life transforming. And recognize that local conversations are where trust and civic life are rebuilt. This is literally the fabric of civic life, of community life, and democracy. We cannot have a democracy, a lowercase d democracy, a government by the people, for the people, without the people and without the ability to engage with one another, whether it's learning and hearing and growing through dialogue or building relationships or making collective action through some semblance of a process to make a collective decision together. That is, in my opinion, true lowercase d democracy, and it does inform our wider republic and the operating mechanisms of this government, of this society. And so this is vital infrastructure for our communities, our civic life, and our society. So what comes next? I invite you to take one small action after today. Try one facilitation move from today. Use a simple agenda to host a conversation. Reflect briefly on what worked, and then stay connected to support and resources. If you're an experienced facilitator and you're like, this is a great refresher, or not, that's okay. But if you think that this could be a benefit to someone, spread the gospel, spread the good word. We want these skills to be in as many hearts and minds and bodies as possible. Huge, huge shout out. I apologize, I was a little remiss in doing this earlier. Huge shout out to the Shift Action Lab and their thoughtfulness, their wisdom, their vision to bring this learning series to fruition, to provide these skills for free to as many people as possible, both here in the room virtually and also in the wider network. We are going to continue to boost out this recording, these resources, this learning series. And so share this recording, share this training, join the future trainings that are coming up. But we're gonna share a little bit more about that, but a few more areas where you can either strengthen your practice or dive into the practice. Here are some practical tools. Now, these are documents that please use. Please feel welcome to modify and to guide your conversation design, your dialogue deliberative design around framing topic. It's a bit of a deeper dive into all of these areas, crafting good questions, a very high level conversation planning tool. We also have a facilitator introduction cheat sheet. What's the general spiel that you should be giving in the beginning part of an event? At least some recommendations. These are all offerings. Take what works, discard the rest. And we do also have a brief document with some high-level conflict management and de-escalation techniques. And I've referenced the facilitation guides that NCDD has been fortunate to partner with the American Library Association on the Libraries Transforming Communities initiative. So there's two for right now, but there's going to be a third coming up in the new year. Leading Conversations Facilitation Guide. This is a even deeper dive into Facilitation 101, many areas that I didn't want to touch on due to bandwidth, and also to provide you with this resource that even though it's tailored to libraries, to library workers, just sub out the word library for you. And the follow-up is the Accessible Conversation Guide. This builds on that Leading Conversations Facilitation Guide, and it's really a deeper dive into how do we design and facilitate community engagement in a way that is inclusive, accessible, fostering belonging, and promoting a sense of dignity for everyone. So these are just some high-level practical tools. But I also want to share with you, there is also a wide network that you are welcome to join if you are not already a part of NCDD. I'm really grateful to see several NCDD members in the attendees list. Hi, everyone. It's so good for you to be here. Thank you so much. And also, I want to invite those who are not familiar with NCDD. The National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation we're a gathering place, a resource center. We share the hot news that's happening in the field, trainings that are upcoming, and we serve as a leader for this community of practice, for this network of people who are passionate about having better conversations and making more effective group decisions together. And so for the last 23 years formally, we have continued to support this incredible network of dialogue and deliberation, whether people identify as an experienced professional facilitator or folks who are just passionate about having better conversations. There are so many resources, trainings, opportunities, networks, communities of practice, or virtual spaces where you can come and dive a little bit deeper. I strongly invite you to join as an official member. Lots of options. Accessibility is important to us as a community, so there is a wide range of sliding scale options. And also, if even that causes a barrier, please feel welcome to reach out to me. We would love to ensure that you have space in the coalition.